Today's daf is Memchet. We're going to start on Mem Zayin Amud Bet, bottom of the page. So it starts with a siman to help remember the upcoming sugya. Ben Abenaim, Pashat, Umachat, Upazar, V'chashav, V'chafinat, Chaverav, siman. That's the siman. That's a mnemonic for somebody who wants to memorize the upcoming sugya. So, Rav Papa asked the following question: Ben Abenaim, Shel Melo Chofnav Mahu. So yesterday we talked about the question of if the Kohen comes and he scoops with his hand the Korban Mincha, which is the flour offering. He scoops with his hand. What happens to the flour that goes in between his fingers? What's the status of that flour? So there was a discussion, how do we deal with it? So today Rav Papa is saying, what about Melo Chofnav? Melo Chofnav means that this is the Ketoret of Yom Kippur. This is not a mincha, this is not flour, but the incense of Yom Kippur. He comes and he takes his two hands, hafina, and some of the incense might get caught, between his fingers. So the question is, what is the status of that? Is that included, in other words? Do we look at what's in between, what seeps in between his fingers? Is that going to be included in the Ketoret? In other words, does that have to be burnt as well? Or is that something extra that doesn't count? Because what he's allowed to offer is only what comes up in his hands. Is what seeps between the fingers considered to have fallen out?
It actually goes through.
It slipped through, but it's stuck in between.
Okay.
In other words, if you take a handful of flour, some of it is going to slip in between your fingers like this. Is this part considered what you took or considered what you didn't take? And what's going back into the pot, right? So that's the question. So, Mai Kami Baile, why is he asking the question? Igamar milo mehatam hainuach. Now, remember, it says milo kumtso and milo chofnav. There's a gezerah shava, there's a comparison of the taking of the ketoret and the taking of the mincha. And in both cases it says melo, full, handful of flour, and 2 hands full of ketoret. So if we're comparing the two, then we should apply the same halacha that we decided upon yesterday regarding the flour that gets caught between the fingers. That should apply also to the ketoret. In other words, it should be the same rule that anything that protrudes out or that goes in between the fingers is going to have a safek. It's going to be it's going to have a doubtful status, which is what we said about yesterday. Okay, so the Gemara answers no, that Rav Papa hachi ba'ele milo chofnav vehevi ba'inan. The question is, he's assuming that we do not make an equation between the ketoret and the mincha. We're not making an equation. We're assuming that they are two separate phenomena. The laws that apply to the flour do not necessarily apply to the incense. But the question is, it says that he should go, and it says melo chofnav vehevi. He should bring his hands full of the ketoret into the Bet HaMikdash, into the Kodesh HaKodeshim rather. But it also, and that he qualifies for. In other words, he has his hands full and he's going in. Or do we say, O dilma v'lakach vevi bainan? It has to be that he took it and brought it in, meaning only the things which he included in his kavanah to take. In other words, is it whatever happens to come up in his hands is good enough? Or it has to only those things that he intended to take with him. So what's caught between his fingers he thought was going to fall through. He didn't intend to take those. That's the question. And the answer is, we don't know. We don't know whether those parts that seep through his fingers or stuck in between his fingers should count towards the ketoret or not. Now it says, Rav Papa says, Pshitali, melokum tzok edikamtse inshe. So when we talk about getting the mincha, the flour for the korban mincha, it means kedekamtse inshe. It means that the way that you do the way that you scoop it should be the way a person normally would scoop something with their hand, which is if you have let's say a bowl of flour, you take the side of your hand, you submerge your hand from the side in, and then you close your hands. Okay, so you come in from a semicircular motion like this into the flour. Close your hand over the flour, and now you have your komets, you have your handful. So the question though is, Ba'ira Papa, or Papa asks the following questions. What if I did this? I stick my hand into the flour, and then I use my fingertips to shovel the flour into my hand. So instead of actually submerging my hand from the side into the flour and then closing my hand, okay, which means that naturally by the semicircular motion of my arm, my hand becomes full, and then I close my fingers over it and I hold on to that part. Instead, I stick my hand in forward, so to speak. I stick my fingers in, curve the fingers around, and use them as a shovel to fill my hand. Does that work, Rav Papa wanted to ask? Or He'll ask another variation on that, or for example, milemata lemala mahu. What if the person turns over their hand? Milemata lemala, he turns his hand upside down. Okay, and what he does is he sticks his hand into the flour, and he closes his hand around the flour. Okay. In other words, one way to do it is, it's upside down. He takes it from the top instead. Now, if you read Rashi, the first case he says pas yado lemata v'tachav etzbotav b'soled b'kamatz kometz. He reads it the opposite way that I just read it. He said it seems to fit this way better. But the way that Rashi reads it is the opposite of what I just said, which is that the first question of Rav Papa was when you come with your hand facing downward and you grab the flour. The second one is when you come this way and you scoop the flour into your hand using your fingers. But from the language of the Gemara, it sounds easier to learn the cases the other way, but that's what Rashi says. And then the third question he asks is minatzad, from the side. Now normally you are supposed to do from the side, so what does it mean from the side? What he means is, according to Rashi, he means you put your hand down on the flour and you push down so that the flour comes up through your fingers into your hand. You use pressure. So all of these ways are not the normal way a person would normally just scoop with their hand, like they're using a shovel from the side. So in all these cases, the answer is tekel. We don't know the answer. Amar Rav Papa says, so we're going to ask the same questions with regard to chafina, which is the taking of the ketoret for the Kodesh HaKodeshim, for Yom Kippur. Okay, with the two hands. So he says we should do it in the normal way. The normal way is you take your two hands together and you bring them together and you scoop up the ketoret. So what are the questions going to be? He says, so same questions again. In other words, what happens if I put my hand upside down and I take the ketoret? Like this. Like I grab it with the palm of my hand facing down with my fingers. Or I stick my fingers in and I shovel it into the palm of my hand. Or what happens if I push my hand downward and allow the ketoret to come up through my fingers into the palm of my hand, through the openings between my fingers into the palm of my hand. Or the last question he asked is bazo if chafan bazo v'kiravan zo etzel zomau. Or if instead of taking my hands together, in other words, how would you scoop with two hands? You would take your right hand, your left hand, you would put the edge of your hand into the ketoret and you would bring it together and bring it out together. But what happens if you do one hand, the other hand, separately, and then you put them together? That wouldn't be the most effective way to do it. You wouldn't get as much that way. So he says in all those cases, again, tekel, we don't know the answer to these questions. These are just questions our Papa asked about unconventional ways. In other words, everybody agrees that the right way to do it is the conventional way of scooping. But what happens if you do it in an unconventional way? What is the status of that? That's the question, and he didn't have the answer to that. Rav Papa, now we turn to Memchet Amud Aleph. Rav Papa Rav Papa asked another question. Now what happens if, now we're going back to flour offerings again. He takes the flour, and let's say he's talking, and it's mixed with oil, remember, so it could be stuck to something. And instead of putting it in the bottom of the kli, because what he did was he would take the scoop, in other words, he would go to the mincha, flour offering, takes a scoop with his hands, like we said, on the side, like that, takes a scoop, puts it into the vessel, that vessel is transported to the mizbech, that part is burnt, the rest of it is eaten by the kohanim. The shirayim, that's what it's called, is eaten by the kohanim. So what happens if instead of putting it in the bottom of this vessel, he took the handful and he stuck it to the side of the vessel? Because it's sticky, it has oil. Okay? So what happens then? Is all we require that it be inside the vessel? If so, we have that. We have inside the vessel. Or maybe it has to be on the bottom of the vessel, and it's not. In other words, that's not the normal way. If I tell you to put this in a bowl, you don't stick it on the side of the bowl, you put it on the bottom of the bowl. So the question is whether it counts or not. And again, tekel, we don't know the answer. More the son of Rav Ashi asked, so the question is, if you turned the kli over, you turned it upside down, and you stick the kometz underneath the vessel, mahu. Okay, so in other words, you placed the you put it upside down. So the question is, hanachab betocho ba'inan v'ha'ika. On one hand, you could say, listen, you need to place it in in the vessel, and you have that. You have it in the vessel. Teko. Again, it's a teko. So the question there seems to be that you turned the vessel upside down. And what you did was you put it inside the vessel. It says tokli. You have it inside the vessel, but the vessel's upside down. So it's sticking in there, but it's upside down. So the question is that considered to be the normal way of placing it? It's not hanacha ketikno. It's not placing it in its normal way. It's placing it in an abnormal way. So therefore, the question is whether that constitutes placing it in the vessel or not. Okay, that seems to be what it is. Some seem to interpret it that it's on the outside of the vessel, but it can't. That would be difficult to accept. According to our version, it's ba'arite demana. It's inside the vessel, but the vessel's turned upside down. So now the Gemara asks, when we talk about it being the handful of the Kohen comes in with 2 handfuls of Ketoret together. So does it have to be mechukot? Does it have to be that nothing is protruding out? In other words, it's completely contained in his 2 hands? It's a narrow definition of handful. Or Gidushot, or should it be a bursting full, that it's bursting out at the seams? He's holding it and it's coming out. Which kind of handfuls do we want? Amar le Rabbi Abba, Rav Ashi. Rabbi Abba said to Rav Ashi, Tashma, come and listen. He said that it shouldn't be mechukot. It shouldn't be so small that you don't see anything. It shouldn't be gidushot that it's bursting out. It should be tifufot. What does tifufot mean? It means that if you hold it, you see a roundedness to the top. In other words, imagine a picture of somebody holding, any kind of incense in their hand, and it almost is like a dome in their hands. Okay, so it's not coming out of their fingers. It's not coming out of the sides, but it's rounded on top. So it's above the surface of their hands, but it's not protruding out the sides. That's the ideal way that it should be. We learned over there. Here's just an at first unrelated subject that's going to become related. What happens if there's a korban? And what happens is they receive the blood in a vessel, right? And then the blood is taken to be thrown on the altar. So that blood that's received in the vessel, let's say it's spilled on the ground. Okay, if they slaughtered the animal and the blood spurted all over the ground, then they didn't catch it. They cannot now go back and collect the blood off of the floor and use it. However, mina keli, if it was collected properly, but then it spilled ala ritzpa v'asafo kasher. In other words, if it fell out of the vessel, they received it, but then it spilled, now they can recollect it off of the ground if possible and use it. So, where do we get this from? Because the rabbis taught, v'lakach midam apar. It says you should take from the blood of the bull. Midam nefesh, v'lo midam or, v'lo midam tamtzit. The word midam hapar, you should take from the blood of the bull, comes to tell you, not from dam ha'or. Not from the blood of the skin, meaning when you make the incision, it bleeds a little bit. That's not the blood that we want. We want the blood from the actual slaughtering of the animal. Okay? And velo midam tamtzit, not the leftover blood after the initial spurting of blood is over. Okay? Midam hapar, and the word midam hapar from the blood of the bull means dam mehapar yikabelenu. So they changed the words around. Instead of saying midam hapar, from the blood of the par, we say dam mehapar. Not midam hapar, from the blood, but blood from the bull, meaning it has to be collected directly from the bull. Meaning to say, because if you're going to tell me that the additional mention of midam hapar, okay, the additional mention of taking it from the blood of the bull means Va'afilu miktzat adam, you only have to take some of it. Va'amar Rav Yehuda, but Rav Yehuda said, "Mekabel tzarich shekabel et kol damo shel par." But the truth is, you have to take all of the blood of the bull. Shenem arvet kol dama par yishpoch el yisod hamizbeach, because it says all of the blood of the bull should be poured onto the side of onto the foundation of the mizbeach. Ela shemamina, rather you should conclude, my midam hapar. What does it mean? You should take from the blood of the bull. Dam mehapar yikabelenu. It means you should receive the blood from the bull. So there are 2 times that it's mentioned. One time it says v'lakach midam hapar. You should take only certain type of blood. What type of blood should you take? You should take the kind that flows out when it actually is slaughtered. That's the kind that we want. Should you just take part of that? No, you should take all of that. So when it says midam hapar a second time, it doesn't mean to say quantitatively you only have to take part of that blood. No, you want all of that blood. What it's telling you is that the way you receive it has to be mehapar, from the directly from the bull, not from the floor. Okay, so what is it? And v'kasavar gor'inu mosifin v'dorashin. And this Tana believes that you can take a letter away, move it, and then interpret. In other words, he's taking the from, which says from the blood of the bull, and he's saying from he puts the word from before the word bull. So he says the blood from the bull, and therefore you have to get it directly from the bull. Ba'era papa. So now we have what is the relevance of this to the price of tea in China, as they say? So, this doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about, but now it does, because Rav Papa asked a question. Ba'era papa, nitpazera ketoret mimilochofnav ma'u. What happens if the Kohen Gadol is doing his job? He takes the handful of ketoret into his two hands, and he drops it on the floor. He trips, drops it on the floor. What happens? Yado katsavar behemadami upsula. Do we look at the hands of the Kohen like the neck of the animal and say, just like if the blood spurted out of the neck of the animal onto the ground, it's no good. You can't collect it. So too, it fell out of his hands, it's no good. Oh, Dilma, or maybe kakli sharetame velopsula, or maybe we look at the hands of the Kohen like a vessel, and just like once you've put the blood into the vessel, if it spills, at least you collected it directly from the source. Here too, we could say it's like the hands of the Kohen or the vessel, and it's like you collected it directly from the source. It's just you have to reconstitute it now. And again, Teku, Rav Papa has a lot of questions and not a lot of answers today. He does not know the answer to that one either. Rav Papa asked, what happens if a person thinks during the collection of the Ketoret, during the taking of the handfuls of Ketoret? What does it mean, think? It means have a wrong thought. Chishev means that in Korbanot, if the Kohen thinks when he's slaughtering the Korban, you know what, I'm going to offer this tomorrow. I'm going to throw the blood tomorrow. I'm going to eat the meat tomorrow. Whatever. He's going to do something at the wrong time. Or he thinks to himself, I'm going to take this blood and I'm going to offer it at a different altar, not at this one. Any thought that he has can be posel the korban. It can invalidate the korban. It's called pigul. Okay, it ruins the korban. Now what about when he's taking the ketoret? What if he takes those handfuls and he thinks, you know what? I'm tired. I'm going to do this tomorrow. I'm going to bring this into the Kodesh HaKodeshim tomorrow. Obviously, he can't do that. But the point is, he had the wrong thought. Does that invalidate the taking of the ketoret? Just like when you slaughter the animal or you receive the blood, if you're thinking, I'm going to throw the blood tomorrow, it invalidates the whole korban. You have to have the right kavanah.
And it's only thoughts about the wrong time.
About the wrong timing or place.
It's not thoughts about it. We're not going to
Makom or Zman.
Today. Or...
No. Makom or Zman. Place or time. Zman is the more strict one. Makom is a little less strict. So, Mahu. So do we compare the handful of komets to the handful of ketoret? In other words, taking the handful of the flour offering, there we really do consider the taking of the handful of the flour offering like the receiving of the blood, or like the slaughtering really of an animal korban. Because how does it work? You take the handful of the flour offering and then you put it into the service vessel, just like you would slaughter the animal and receive its blood in a service vessel. So that's what's compared. So if we're going to compare the taking of the handful of incense to the taking of a handful of flour, and we know that in the case of a taking of a handful of flour, if you have the wrong intent, if you take that handful of flour thinking, I'm going to offer this on the Mizbeach tomorrow, it's no good. So it should be the same rule. If you take the handfuls and you think, I'm going to do this tomorrow, it should be no good. Oh, lo, or maybe we say, no, it's not exactly the same. We don't compare the halachot necessarily of mincha to the halachot of ketoret. It's a different phenomenon. So the Gemara says, Amar le Rav Shimi bar Ashi, le Rav Papa, Rav Shimi bar Ashi said to Rav Papa, Tashma, come in here. There's a Mishnah, Masechet Eduyot, that explicitly addresses this issue and says as follows. Hosif Rabbi Akiva added, it should say hasolet, not a kometz, the flour, va'ketoret, the ketoret, va'levona, that's the frankincense that was offered together, that was offered every Shabbat when they would bring the lechem apanim, when they would distribute the lechem apanim among the kohanim to eat from the previous week, and they would put the new lechem apanim, they had the livona, v'gehalim, and the coals. She'im nagat tivul yom b'miktzatan pasalet kulan. That even if a tivul yom, meaning somebody who is tamei today, let's say they touched a sheretz, they touched a dead animal, they went to the mikveh, they're called tivul yom. Why? Because they have to wait till tonight to be complete. So they're quasi-tahor. If they touch something, they can make it tameh. If they touch something that's a korban, they can make it tameh. Now, if they touch just a part of the flour or the ketoret, or anything like that, they make the entire thing tameh. If they touch part of something which is not holy, not fully consecrated, then only the part that they touched would be affected. But if they touch something that's consecrated, everything that's consecrated will become tameh. And it says the ketoret, meaning that if he touches, let's say the Kohen Gadol is walking with a tevul yom comes and he touches part of the ketoret, the entire thing will become tameh. Entire thing. So the Gemara infers, kasal kadatach mida pasal tevul yom pisala namilina. Pasala namilina. Umidalina pasala nami machshava. And the assumption is that anything that a tivul yom will invalidate by touching, would also be invalidated if it were left overnight. Meaning, once something is fully consecrated for use that day, like it's been put into a service vessel, now it has a time limit. It's like those things that you buy from the store. Once you open it, there's a deadline, right? Once you open the package, you have to use it 7 days. Okay? So once you place the mincha, the flour, into the service vessel, you didn't have to offer it today, let's say. But once you place it in the service vessel, now it has a deadline. Time is ticking. Got to do it. So since that's true, if you leave it overnight, it will be invalidated. But if you left that entire korban mincha and you never took the kometz, it might not have been invalidated. Only because you took part of it and you put it in the vessel, now it has to be offered today. And by the same token, okay, pasala nami machshava, that doing that action of taking it also can invalidate if you have the wrong kavanah. In other words, all these things are connected. Placing it into the service vessel, okay, the fact that it can be invalidated by a tivul yom, touching it. The fact that if it's left overnight, it will be invalidated. And the fact that when you place it in that vessel, if you have the wrong idea in mind, it will invalidate it. They're all connected. Because before you do that action of taking that part of the offering and moving it to the vessel, it's preliminary. So whatever you think or do, it doesn't have the same effect. Okay, so in this, it says ketoret though, and we're assuming it's referring to the ketoret of the Kohen Gadol. So having it in his hands is considered like having it in a service vessel, which means that when he takes it in his hands, his thought can invalidate it, just like when you take the flour and put it in a service vessel, your thought can invalidate it. Because you see that once it makes it into his hands, it achieves that level of kedusha as if it were put in a service vessel. Ba'ir Rav Papa asked another question, and we turn to Amud Bet. Chayshev b'hatayat gehalim mahu. What about when the Kohen Gadol goes up to the top of the Mizbeach to take his coals, the coals to burn the ketoret? What about those? If he thinks, I'm going to take these coals and I'm really going to do this tomorrow, does it affect the service or not? Or do we just ignore that? So the Gemara says, Ma'u, machshirei mitzvah k'mitzvah damu, olo. Do we consider it machshirei mitzvah? In other words, it's a preliminary to the mitzvah. Taking the gechalim, taking those coals, that's not the mitzvah. The mitzvah is burning the incense on the coals. But it's preliminary. So do we consider whatever thoughts he had at the time, just like we consider what the thoughts that he has when he actually picks up the ketoret to invalidate? So too we should consider the thoughts that he has when he scoops up the gechalim to invalidate, because it's part of the avodah, it's part of the service. Or do we say no, it's a mere preliminary, and therefore whatever thoughts he had when he took those coals are not going to affect the service? And again, teiko, we don't know the answer. They asked Rav Sheshet a question, holachab bismol mahu. If we know that almost all avodah in the Beit HaMikdash has to be done by the right hand, what happens if the Kohen, we know he has to receive the blood using his right hand, he has to slaughter using his right hand, he has to throw the blood onto the altar using his right hand. But what about holacha? Holacha is when you transfer the blood, you walk with it, you carry it from the place where the cow is, the animal is, to the altar. Does that have to be done with the right hand, or can it be done with the left hand? They asked him. So Amar Lu Rav Sheshet. Rav Sheshet says, Tanitua, we learned already. Natalata machta bimino ve'takaf bismolo. We already learned that when the Kohen Gadol goes into the Kodesh HaKodeshim, what does he do? He carries the incense in his left hand and the coals in his right hand. So obviously carrying in your left hand is not an invalidation. And the Gemara asks, V'nifshot lehu meha, why doesn't he quote the following Mishnah? Ditnan haregel shel yamin bismol ubet ora lachutz. We learned earlier in this Masechet, in fact, that when they would cut up the parts of the animal, the Kohen who was carrying the rear right leg of the animal would carry it in his left hand. He's carrying, in other words, part of the sacrifice in his left hand. So obviously left-handed carrying is okay. So too, carrying the blood in the left hand should be okay. Answer, why doesn't he use that proof? Because because if I only knew that you could bring the limbs of an animal to the mizbeach using your left hand, I would say, you know why? Because carrying the limbs is not as important as carrying the blood of the korban. The blood of the korban is actually what effectuates the fulfillment of the korban, is the putting of the blood. So if that were done with your left hand, maybe that wouldn't be good. Bringing the limbs onto the mizbeach, as long as the blood was thrown on the mizbeach, even if the limbs were destroyed or became tamei, or they weren't placed on the mizbeach, you still fulfilled the mitzvah already. So maybe I would think, that's why we're lenient over there. But the ketoret, bringing it into the kodesh HaKodeshim, or the blood, bringing it up to the mizbeach, there it has to be with the right hand. That's why Rav Papa says, he quoted the case of the ketoret to show you that it could be carried with the left hand and can be valid. So too, carrying, the actual avodot have to be done with the right hand, but the carrying, the transportation, could be done with the left hand. Now, that's what it says at the end of our Amud. Tomorrow's daf is going to explore whether this is in fact true, and is actually going to reject this view of Rav Papa and refute it, but it goes all the way into the next Amud, pretty far in, so we're going to stop here for today.